So, all right, we will start the book of Samuel today, but we only talked a little bit last time about the introduction to the book, and I want to spend a little bit more time looking at the introduction. It's a lengthy introduction in the Altar, Ancient Israel, from page 223 to 237, and we're not going to look at all of it. But start with the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So let's look at altar before we start delving into the text. The major sequence that runs according to the conventional book and chapter divisions of later editorial traditions, from 1 Samuel 1 to 1 Kings 2, is one of the most astounding pieces of narrative that has come down to us from the ancient world. The story of David is probably the greatest single narrative representation in antiquity of a human life, evolving by slow stages through time, shaped and altered by the pressures of political life, public institutions, family, the impulses of body and spirit, the eventual sad decay of the flesh. It also provides the most unflinching insight into the cruel processes of history and into human behavior warped by the pursuit of power. And nowhere is the Bible's astringent narrative economy, its ability to find characters and etch revelatory dialogue in a few telling strokes, more brilliantly deployed. Okay, so I also want to say about this that in day school, I went to day school from kindergarten through 12th grade. The only year I was not in day school was 7th grade, just because of where we lived, that there wasn't a day school opportunity for 7th grade. But so K through 12, I was in day school, and in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade, I think, we studied, because it's day school, you study Bible, we studied the book of Samuel. So it's a regular part of the curriculum in Jewish day school. I would say at least in community day school. I would imagine in Orthodox day schools as well. It might be just in a different year in day school that they start doing it. But this is, so this is when I was in middle school and high school. So that was just a few years ago. I would imagine it's still something that's taught in day school. I know my kids, we have a copy of the Hebrew edition with Rashi of Shmuel in my home, so I know how to buy it for our kids when they were studying it at the Charles E. Smith Day School. So because it is a work of literature, because it is Bible, and because it is the foundation of the Jewish nation, not the Torah is the foundation of the Jewish people, which makes it the most important book to study. But Shmuel is an important book to study to understand the history of the nation and leading up to the building of the temple, et cetera, et cetera. So. We're reading from Altar's Ancient Israel. I just read the first paragraph on page 223 and just talking about an introduction to the book of Samuel from Altar. So he's calling it in the ancient world, how the book of Samuel 1 and 2, books 1 and 2, and also the first two chapters of the book of Kings is one unusual literary unit. It must also be said, I'm reading now, after nearly 2 centuries of excavative scholarship, that is archaeology, that the precise literary history and authorship of this great narrative remain beyond recovery. So, in other words, archaeologists have not found anything from this period of time in all of their diggings throughout the land of Israel. Okay? And now, there was something that said Beit David on it, the house of David, which is a reference to the Davidic dynasty, but that's post the book of Samuel, because the book of Samuel is about David himself. So, nothing has been found yet that proves that it is from this time that's described here. To specialists who have exercised painstaking analysis in order to expose an intricate patchwork of sources and historical layers in the book as a whole, and in most of its episodes, it may seem a provocation or an expression of ignorance to speak at all of the story of Samuel, Saul, and David. So, in other words, the fact that you can't prove that Samuel, Saul, and David existed might, for some, say this is ridiculous to read about it because we're reading a fantasy, not something factual. Even a reader looking for unity must concede that certain passages are not of a piece with the rest. The most salient of these is the coda placed just before the end of the David story in 2 Samuel 21 to 24, which comprises material from 4 different sources, none of them reflecting the style or perspective of the David story proper. Eventually we'll get there, and we'll talk about it at that point, about how different it might seem from the rest of the book that we had been reading. It may be unwise to think of these disparate passages as intrusions, because creating a purposeful collage of sources was demonstrably a standard literary procedure in ancient Israel. In any case, the architectonic cohesion of the narrative, I just love Alter's terms, right? What is it about academics that they need to show off with their Oxford English Dictionary words? Okay, just write normally. Especially since there's no footnotes here. If it's a scholarly book with footnotes, okay, use all the fancy terms you want. But this is clearly for people like us to read. What do we need a word like architectonic for? Okay, in any case, the architectonic cohesion of the narrative from the birth of Samuel to the death of David has been made increasingly clear by the innovative literary commentary of the past 3 decades, and much of the richness and complexity of the story is lost by those who imagine this book as a stringing together of virtually independent sources, a prophetic Samuel narrative, a cycle of Saul's stories, a history of the rise of David, a succession narrative, and so forth. Readers should not be confused by the conventional division into books. The entities 1 and 2 Samuel are purely an artifact of ancient manuscript production. Okay, it's really one book, and when you wrote a manuscript, it was just easier to divide it into 2. Scrolls used by scribes were roughly the same length, and when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in the 3rd century BCE, a single scroll was not long enough to encompass the whole book, so it was divided into 2 parts, in no way intrinsic to the original composition. The Talmud speaks of a single book of Samuel. It is also demonstrable that the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings, as I shall try to show in my commentary, are the real conclusion of the book, subtly echoing earlier moments in the story and evincing the same distinctive literary mastery. Later, redactors placed these 2 episodes at the beginning of Kings so that they could serve as a preface to the story of Solomon. But if the ancient editors pass this material down to posterity as a book, what are we to make of its composite nature? 2 fundamental issues are involved: the presence of the so-called Deuteronomist in the book, and the introduction of purportedly independent narratives. In regard to the second of these 2 considerations, the baseline for modern scholarly discussion was set in a 1926 monograph by the German scholar Leonhard Rost. He concentrated on what he saw as two independent narratives: an arc narrative, 1 Samuel 4 to 7:1, plus 2 Samuel 6, and a succession narrative, 2 Samuel 9 to 20, and 1 Kings 1 to 2. The argument for an originally independent arc narrative has a good deal of plausibility. There are some stylistic differences in this segment. Human agents at the center of the surrounding narrative are marginal. Miraculous intervention by God, not in evidence elsewhere, is decisive, and the figure of Samuel with which the story began temporarily disappears. All right, we'll get to the arc narrative soon because it's chapter 4. The arc narrative is often thought to be the oldest component of the book of Samuel, perhaps actually pre-Davidic, because it does not envisage a royal cult in Jerusalem and has no interest in the more political concerns of the larger story. Even in this case, however, the narrative in question has to be read in the context of the comprehensive literary structure into which it has been integrated, whether by editorial ingenuity or by the elusive artistry of the author of the David story. Thus, the old priest Eli, sitting at the gate awaiting the news of disaster from the battlefield, news that will include the death of his sons, generates a haunting avatar in the aging David at Mahanaim, sitting between the two gates of the walled city, anxiously awaiting the messenger from the battlefield who will tell him of the death of his son. A second scene of receiving catastrophic tidings is tied in with Eli. The old priest hears an uproar in the town, asks what it means, and then a messenger arrives to give him a breathless report of the terrible defeat, just as the usurper Adonijah, at the head of the David story, at the end of the David story, will hear an uproar in the town, and then a breathless report from an eyewitness of the developments that have destroyed his hopes for the throne. All right, so he's just laying out for us to remember some literary devices that serve as kind of a unifying force within the entire book. Events that happen to Eli that also happen to, it's actually Eli, that's how it's pronounced in Hebrew. Events that happen to Eli that also happen to David or to David's son Adonijah. Okay, so it's getting more into details here about the specifics and of the book. And let me just see, just a second. All right, so if we go, let's turn to page 235, near the top, the start of the paragraph, my guess. My guess is that the author of the David story thought of himself as a historian. But even if he frequented the court in Jerusalem, a plausible but not at all necessary supposition, he was by no means a writer of court annals or chronicles of the kings of Judea. And, as I have argued, he was far from being an apologist for the Davidic dynasty. There are critiques of David in the book of Samuel. I would imagine that he was impelled to write out of a desire to convey to his contemporaries and to posterity a true account of the significant events involved in the founding of the monarchy that governed the nation. It is conceivable that he had some written reports of these events at his disposal, or at any rate drew on oral accounts of the events. Perhaps he had spoken with old-timers who were actual participants, or if one places him very early, he himself might have been an observer of some of what he reports. He also did not hesitate to exploit ideological tales, that is, stories that tell us how things came to be. Saul among the prophets, and folk tales, David slaying the giant Goliath, in order to flesh out his historical account and dramatize its meanings. Though committed to telling the truth about history, his notion of historical factuality was decidedly different from modern ones. His conception of history writing involved not merely registering what had happened and who had been the principal actors, but also reflecting on the shifting interplay between character and historical act, on the way social and political institutions shape and distort individual lives, on the human costs of particular political choices. The author of the David story was in all likelihood firmly committed to the legitimacy of the Davidic line. In the book he wrote, after all, God explicitly elects David once Saul has been rejected, and later promises that the throne of David will remain unshaken for all time. That is a religious foundational element of Judaism that, and also is part of the foundation of Christianity. That is, that the future Messiah, that is the one that will come in the end of days to bring back all the Jewish people to live in the land of Israel and reestablish the kingdom in Israel. The Messiah, that king, will be descended from King David. Okay, that's absolutely clear. It's in the prophets. The prophet Isaiah says it clearly. And we talk about it. We talk about it. It's in the Mourner's Kaddish, in the Sephardic edition of the Mourner's Kaddish. So, Yikadal v'yikadash shemei rabbah, be'alma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei. So, in Aramaic, that the kingdom will be reestablished. And then Sephardim add v'yitzmach porkanei v'karev meshichei, and that the ritual, the temple worship will be reestablished, and the Messiah will come soon. So that's in the Sephardic edition of the Kaddish. So Kaddish talks about reestablishment of the kingdom in Jerusalem. Our prayers talk about it all the time. So it's all about it's all about David. It's in the Kedusha, the prayer that's recited when we repeat the Amidah, Al Yedei David Mashiach Tzidkecha, right? Your righteous anointed one. So David as central figure to the king of Israel and the Davidic line. Even though, if we read the Bible, you can count on one hand how many of the kings descended from David were good kings of Israel. Good being righteous, loyal to the covenant with God, and making sure that Israelite worship happened in the temple and not idolatry. So, on one hand, you had Solomon. So you can have David, you can have Solomon, and you have Hezekiah, that is, and Josiah. Maybe, I think those are it. So one of them, Josiah, we read about the reforms that he instituted, that is part of the Haftarah for Shabbat Shekalim, and Hezekiah. If you've been to Israel and you've been on tours of Israel, you might have walked through the Hezekiah tunnel. So Hezekiah is seen as a righteous king of Israel by the rabbis. Yes, Solomon turned to idolatry at the end of his life, and he had many, many wives and many, many concubines, but he built the temple in Jerusalem. So that is the fact that he had so many wives and maybe turned to idolatry at the end of his life, that is at least overlooked because Solomon built the temple.
Rabbi?
Yes.
In some respects, were some of the, when the temple existed, they had the Kohanim. They had a religious institution. Yes. To take care of that, and the kings did not have to exercise
Well, they kind of worked in concert together, and so we won't see this in the book of Samuel, but we see it in the book of Kings, because when the succession from David to Solomon happened, there was one priest and one priestly line who supported one son of David, and another priest and priestly line that supported the other line of David. So, Dove, your argument for an independent priestly caste, that priestly family that will take care of the temple, totally independent of the monarchy, in theory should exist, but did not exist. They supported each other. And, it's not unlike politics in the world today, no matter what country. People tend to align with political figures who they think are going to be successful. And that either they're right or they're wrong, and either they're rewarded or they're not. So the same thing with the temple in Jerusalem. So the temple, the priestly families were corrupted by the monarchy, and the monarchy also was corrupted by the priestly families. So there was the same story of this Josiah. So he became king at age 7. So at age 7, you can't really be king. The high priest was involved, I believe, in educating and running things for a while. So were the priests just involved in the temple and not involved in politics? No, there were stories in the Bible of their intermingling, and also from the Bible's perspective, the resultant sins and punishments that came to the people of Israel because of the corruption, not only of the monarchy, but of the priesthood. So Barry.
Yeah. For the Jews that splintered off of the priestly, Jewish class and embraced Jesus of Nazareth, did they actually trace Jesus's genealogy?
Oh, yeah. So right. So in the Gospels, whatever gospel traces the genealogy of Jesus, Jesus, because the early followers, Jesus himself was Jewish, might have been a rabbi. All his followers were good Jews. They went to synagogue. Jesus went to synagogue. He preached in synagogue. And so if they're going to preach that Jesus is the Messiah, well, they have to prove it and say that he's descended from King David. And they have to prove it that way because his followers are Jews. And according to our Bible, the Messiah is a descendant of King David. So I don't remember which one of the Gospels, but it traces his lineage from his father Joseph all the way back to King David. And it's done on purpose. And absolutely, you cannot prove it. You absolutely cannot prove your lineage in that way. But, some rabbis of the time of the Mishnah also purportedly trace their lineage back to kings or prophets in Israel. Can they actually prove it? I don't know. Did they really have something in their family that passed down, and the next generation would write their name onto this piece, this tablet or this papyrus to prove that they are the next generation? I can't rule it out, but we just don't have enough evidence like that. Thank you, Ron. Matthew and Luke both trace the lineage of Jesus' parents. Thanks. So yes, I've read the Christian Bible a couple of times, but I don't know it as well as the Jewish Bible. But yes, but that is an element that sticks out to me from reading the Christian Bible, the importance that it places on tracing Jesus back to King David, because of the idea that the Messiah has to be descended from King David. So will that be the case? Who knows? We believe it's a major tenet of Judaism. It's part of Maimonides' listing of the 13 tenets of Judaism, that we have to believe in the coming of the Messiah and that the Messiah is son of David. Okay, so will there be a Messiah? I don't know. But so I can't say because I don't know or that it's unlikely that I don't believe in it. There's nothing wrong in believing in it and I understanding what the Messianic era could bring to the world, not just peace and justice, but also centrality of worship and no more arguing who's right, who's wrong, no more killing. It's good to believe in that kind of era arising, and as the rabbis teach, to try to live the Messianic era today, that we're supposed to lead our lives and conduct our lives in a fashion in which we're trying to bring the Messiah. Okay. Okay, so I just want to go to Alter's lengthy last paragraph on the bottom of 236 and 237. One of the hallmarks of this whole writerly relation to the historical material is the freighted imagining of the detail not strictly necessary to the historical account. Let me offer one brief instance that may stand for all the others. David's first wife, Michal, it will be recalled, is married off by her father Saul to a man named Paltiel, son of Laish, after David's flight from his father-in-law's assassins. We know nothing about Paltiel except his name, and nothing about Michal's feelings concerning the union with him imposed by her father. When Avner, the commander of the forces of the house of Saul, comes to transfer his fealty to David at the end of the civil war, David stipulates that Michal, daughter of Saul, must first be sent back to him. Presumably, his motive is strictly political. Michal is duly removed by Avner's decree from Paltiel, with no word or emotion of hers reported by the writer. What he does give us are these few indelible words, and her husband went with her, weeping, as he went after her, as far as Bahurim. And Avner said to him, "Go back," and he went back. To a sober historian, this moment might well seem superfluous. To a great imaginative writer, like the author of this story, such moments are the heart of the matter. Paltiel never even speaks in the story, but his weeping speaks volumes. He is a loving husband caught between the hard and unyielding men who wield power in the world, Avner, Saul's tough field commander, and his adversary turned ally David, who insists on the return of the woman he has acquired with a bloody bride price because he calculates that as Saul's daughter, she will bolster his claim to be Saul's legitimate successor. The tearful Paltiel, walking after the wife who is being taken from him, then driven back by the peremptory word of the strong man with whom he cannot hope to contend, is a poignant image of the human price of political power. If history, in the hackneyed aphorism, is the story told by the victors, this narrative achieves something closer to the aim that Walter Benjamin defined as the task of the historical materialist, to brush history against the grain. Lacking all but the scantiest extra historical evidence, we shall probably never know precisely what happened in Jerusalem and Judea and the high country of Benjamin around the turn of the first millennium BCE, when the Davidic dynasty was established. What matters is that the anonymous Hebrew writer, drawing on what he knew or thought he knew of the portentous historical events, has created this most searching story of men and women in the rapid and dangerous current of history that still speaks to us, floundering in history and the dilemmas of political life 3,000 years later. Okay.
Jonah,
Yes, Barry.
so just sort of a practical question. A few years back, I read Alter's The David Story, which I think maybe I didn't get Ancient Israel because I have his whole complete set.
Yeah.
Although it's very unwieldy to
Yes.
find pages in it because it's like huge. But how is the Ancient Israel different from the David story that starts with Samuel and goes into, is it superfluous or is it the
I don't know. So I'm not familiar with Alter's book, The David Story. So So I can't tell you. I can't answer the question because I'm not familiar with that material. I don't know which came first. Did he write the ancient Israel first? I think he wrote ancient Israel in the process of writing his translation of the Bible, his translation and commentary of the Bible. So instead of waiting until the whole Bible was done, he published it piece by piece.
Okay.
But I don't know about his work on the David story.
Because the David story is great. I mean, it starts with it starts with Samuel and
Right.
has a lot. I think it has a lot of the same,
I'm sure it does. So he probably takes from that and summarizes it and puts it into the commentary that we have here in ancient Israel.
yeah. And just I mentioned this to you years ago, but for the class, there's a German Jewish writer who actually has an incredible novel called The King David Report, and it's basically about a writer living in Jerusalem who is summoned by Solomon to write the history
Oh,
of King David. And it's, I mean, he hews to the story. I mean, this
right,
novel sticks to the story, but it kind of talks about all the machinations of what you just said about,
right,
David's wives, and how he had to kind of balance telling the truth
right,
with telling a heroic story.
right, right. Yeah, and that I think is the issue for the Jewish perspective of our Bible, that we want it wants to place David on a pedestal, but it's not willing to do so by whitewashing certain events in his life. It presents issues in his life that are difficult to read and are, what some other politician would throw the person in jail for writing such truth. And that didn't happen. So that the fact that the truth is still there says something too for how we're supposed to understand the story. So the our edition that I'll be reading from, the text itself with the commentary on the page has an introduction also, and I only just want to look at the chronology piece that is on page Roman numeral 13. So on Roman numeral 13, we find chronology there on the left. The chronology of Samuel is obscure and reaches firm ground only in a note giving the duration of David's rule. That is 2 Samuel 5:4. David reigned 40 years, 7 as king of Judah alone, and 33 as king of all Israel. And the dates are variously given by modern scholars, as from 1016 to 976 or 1010 to 970 BCE. For the period of Samuel and Saul, the chronological data in our text are incomplete and vague, just where precision is most desired. That is, on the duration of Samuel's judgeship and of Saul's reign. Saul is said to have reigned for 2 years, but even the rabbinic commentators disagree on the interpretation of the statement, and the difficulty of believing that all the events of Saul's reign could have been crowded into 2 years is such that most modern commentators feel compelled to treat the numbers in 1 Samuel 13 as defective. David's stay among the Philistines was itself a matter of 16 months. According to the Talmud, Samuel died at the age of 52, having aged prematurely because of his grief for Saul. The figure was reached by the following calculation. It was believed that the day on which Hannah prayed for a son before Eli was the same day on which Eli was appointed judge. As Eli held office for 40 years, this would make Samuel 39 years old at Eli's death. The 20 years during which the ark remained in Kiryat Yearim were understood to refer to the whole period between its return from Philistia and its transfer to Jerusalem by David, which was considered to have taken place immediately after his capture of the city. David had been king for 7 years before the conquest of Jerusalem, which leaves a period of 13 years between the death of Eli and that of Saul. Samuel's death was supposed to have antedated Saul's by only a few months. Hence, Samuel died at the age of 52. Okay, so that's all. I don't want to read any more about that. All of it, it's all guesses, really, about, and Alter made that point as well. We don't know anything about the history as presented, supposedly presented as history here in the book. Okay, so let's start reading chapter 1. And chapter 1 may be familiar to us because it makes up part of the Haftarah for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so, and that's what the note is with the asterisk. If in the Hebrew, right below the line there, verse 1, Haftarah liyom rishon shel Rosh Hashanah. Haftarah for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So, and the Haftarah continues also into chapter 2. So anyway, so it's a familiar story, and one that it takes a prominent part in the liturgy, and it's here as a haftarah for Rosh Hashanah because the Torah portion on Rosh Hashanah is God remembering God's promise to Abraham and Sarah, and the birth of Isaac, and the resultant miraculous birth of Isaac. And here we have a woman praying to God to have a child, as opposed to God in the story in Genesis proactively coming to Abraham and Sarah and telling them they will have a child. So we don't have in the Torah Sarah praying for a child. We have Rebecca praying for a child, and she's answered with twins. She prays, but Sarah doesn't pray. Here, Hannah is praying. Okay, so let's start the story. Let's see how far we get. Vayehi ish echad min haramatayim Sofim mehar Ephraim Ushemo Elkanah ben Yeroham ben Elihu ben Tohu ben Tsuf Ephrati. So there was one man, or there was a man from Ramatayim. So the English says Ramatayim Sofim is the name of the town. I only question that, and Alter does it too in his translation. I question it only because of the trup mark under Ramatayim, because it's a tavir, which means the word is sung separately. It's not really it's like independent. And so if I were to chant it, Ish echad min haramatayim Sofim mehar Ephraim. So by the way I sing it, haramatayim Sofim mehar Ephraim. So it seems like Ramatayim is separate from Sofim. So in other words, if it was one town, if it was a name that went together, why wouldn't it be Min haramatayim Sofim mehar Ephraim? Okay, so it would be one musical phrase that would put Ramatayim and Sofim together. That's all. I'm just making a note, which is obscure and could be ridiculous, but it clearly, our translation and Alter's translation says the town is called Ramatayim Sofim. I'm only saying that the trup makes it hard to read it that way. Okay, so he's from Ramatayim Sofim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name is, and this is unusual in that we find his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather listed. Okay, usually it would just be Elkanah ben Yeroham. But it's Elkanah, son of Yeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Tsuf, and Ephraimite. Okay? So...
Rabbi?
Yes.
Is that perhaps because it traces the lineage of the tribe? I mean, here we are in the country of Ephraim, and it's
Yeah.
tracing it back to Ephraimite.
I don't know. Let's read a little bit more and then we'll look at the commentary to see. I'm not sure why such a lengthy genealogy is given. It's very, very unusual for the Bible to list somebody's lineage that far back. We have it, but I'm just saying it's unusual. We're told we're told at the end of the book of Ruth about the birth of David. So David is the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of Obed, the son of Boaz, and then we're also told about Boaz's lineage as well. So there are people in the Bible who have a lengthy lineage, but it's unusual to have this much, that your great-great-grandfather is listed. Okay, so 2, Velo shtei nashim, shem achat Chana, v'shem hashenit Penina, vayehi lifenina yeladim, ulechana ein yeladim. So he had 2 wives. The name of one was Chana, and the name of the second, or the other, it could be translated either way, Penina. And Penina had children. It's translated here as children. It could be boys, but I guess boys, it would say banim. So it says yeladim. So Penina had children, and Chana did not have children. So Penina, by the way, is a gem or a pearl. Chana is God's grace. Like the masculine equivalent of Chana would be Yochanan, or it could be just Hanan. So Chana, very popular Hebrew name, not just Hannah in English, but Anne or Anna. All of these names are all, anyway, just talking about the names. These are popular Hebrew names today. 3, Ve'ala ha'ish hahu me'iro miyamim yamima lehishtahavot Velizbawach la'Adonai Tsevaot b'Shilo, v'sham shnei v'nei Eli, Chofni u'Finchas, Kohanim la'Adonai. So that man would go from his city. Now it's translated here from year to year. Or you could say he had this long established practice of going from his city to worship and to sacrifice to Adonai Tsevaot. So just interesting. It's always interesting to me how God is named in a particular story in the Bible. So Adonai Tsevaot. In Joshua and Judges, has God been referred to as Adonai Tsevaot? I don't think so. Adonai Tsevaot is common in the prayer book, but it's not so common in the Bible. So this could be the first time that God is listed as, okay, so I look at the commentary right now on page 2, Lord of Hosts. This is the first use in the Bible of a title which became current in Israel. Okay, so I'm just saying, it's just interesting to me about the story in the Bible about how God is referred to. So, and then the question would be, why is God referred to as Adonai Tsevaot, and what's the tradition that led to it? Like, who made it up? And why would it be made up here for this story? So I would argue it's not made up. There's a tradition. But where's the tradition from if we haven't seen it before in the Bible? So just an interesting question to raise about why God is referred to as Adonai Tsevaot. So he went to worship and to sacrifice to Adonai Tsevaot in Shiloh. And we only know that Shiloh would be the place because it just happened to be mentioned at the end of Judges. Nowhere in the rest of Judges was it told at all about any kind of temple or any kind of sacrificial system being established in Shiloh. It was only in the last chapter or two of Judges that it was mentioned. Okay, so we have that connection to the previous book, but the name of God is not connected to any previous book. So he goes to worship and to offer sacrifice to Adonai Tzvaot in Shiloh, and there were the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Pinchas, who were priests to God. Okay, so now,
Jonah? Oh.
yes, yes.
Oh, I was just to say, no, but before you go on, I mean, you're on a different topic, but just going back to the two wives of Elkanah, it's just a little bit of a reminder of, like, Rachel and Leah. Because
Yes, absolutely.
Not that it says that he loves one more than the other, but definitely
Right.
one had children, one didn't. And then Rachel, she prayed to God too, I think, just to,
Yes, yeah, but I only brought it up just that Sarah, that you have to wait to the next generation for
Rachel.
someone to be praying for a child. But yes, right. Okay, so yes, we're going to be learning more about the relationship of Hannah and Peninnah momentarily, and we're going to be learning about Elkanah feeling sorry for Hannah momentarily. But yes, Hannah is listed first in verse 2, and then so it's one wife was Hannah and the other one was Peninnah. But the fact that it's Achat and Sheni, well, it kind of is, Hebrew forces it to be understood as one and the other, but it could be number one was Hannah and number two was Peninnah. You could translate it that way from the verse, right? In other words, that he married Hannah first, or he loved Hannah more than Peninnah, or that she was the chief wife and Peninnah was the secondary wife. We don't know, but the Hebrew is vague enough with Achat and Sheni to have us question those things about the relationship between Hannah and Peninnah and Elkanah. So Hannah goes first, but then in the second half of the verse, it says Peninnah had children, but Hannah didn't have children. But it could have said Hannah didn't have children and Peninnah had children. So in other words, Hannah's listed first, and the second one is Peninnah. And it could have said Hannah did not have children and Peninnah had children. So you keep the same Hannah, Peninnah, Hannah, Peninnah. But the verse has Hannah, Peninnah, then Peninnah, Hannah. Now, it could have done that on purpose to have that kind of symmetry, the asymmetry to make it symmetrical. Hannah, Peninnah, Peninnah, Hannah. So A, B, B, A. But it could have been A, B, A, B. Okay, so let's stop here and look at the commentary here, and we'll also look at Alter on these three verses. So, in our text, now the Hebrew is literally and. It has been suggested that the purpose of the conjunction. So, lots of books of the Bible start with a vav. So, why start with a vav? Commonly translated as and. So, Torah scrolls, there is a way to write a Torah scroll that's accepted by scribes, by Sofrim, who actually do the work of writing a Torah scroll, that it's called a Vav Torah scroll, that each column of the Torah, except for the first column, of course, because you can't help it, the first word of the Torah is the word Breshit, but every other column starts with the letter Vav. And so clearly, it shows that it's one continuous story. So books of the Bible start with a vav. Then it shows that the whole Bible is one story, as opposed to separate, independent books. Okay. The Hebrew is literally and. It has been suggested that the purpose of the conjunction is to connect the history contained in this book with that of the book of Judges. But independent histories in the Bible begin with the same conjunction. For example, Ruth, Jonah, Esther, and it's more likely that the particle of conjunction is a formal opening to a historical narrative without any connecting force. Okay, maybe. Okay, it could be a style, but I'm suggesting the religious understanding of it's all one story is a reason to understand. It could be a way to understand it too.
I think,
Yes.
I don't know if this is a relevant comment, but that the Vav changes the past tense, the future tense to the past tense.
Yeah, so there's in biblical grammar, the vav, it's called vav hahipuch. It's the turning upside down vav. So but this gets into technical grammatical stuff. But usually there are prefixes added to a verb to make it future tense. So if you put the vav before the future tense prefix, that makes the future verb into a past tense. So yes, we could read this. There was, as opposed to there is or there will be a man from Ramatayim. Okay. Ramatayim Tzofim. It is clear from verse 19 that Ramah is meant. Ramatayim, which is the dual form of Ramah, is a form of the name which is found only here, and no satisfactory explanation of its use has been given. The Talmud suggests two heights facing each other. The epithet Sophim distinguishes Samuel's Ramah from other towns of the same name. Suf is mentioned in chapter 9 as the name of the district in which Saul finds Samuel's home, and it's possible that both it and Sophim are to be connected with Elkanah's ancestor, Tsuf, right? That's his great-grandfather. See 1 Chronicles 6:2. Ramah, okay, there he's called Sophi. Here it's Tsuf. Ramah, height, is a common biblical place name, but the site of Samuel's Ramah is not definitely known. Suggested identifications are Ram, 5 miles due north of Jerusalem, Ram Allah, on the western slopes of Mount Ephraim, 9 miles north of Jerusalem, which actually could be Ramallah, Beit Rimah, a village on a hill 12 miles northwest of Beit El, and Rentis, a small village 5 miles west of Beit Rimah. Okay. Hill country of Ephraim, the central mountainous district of the Holy Land in which the tribe of Ephraim settled. The name may have extended southwards to the territory of Benjamin if Ramah lay there. Son of Yeroham, Elkanah's genealogy is given with slight variations twice in 1 Chronicles 6, 11 and 19, where his ancestry is traced back to Kohat, the son of Levi. So interesting that there in 1 Chronicles he's a Levi. Here he's an Ephraimite. Okay. An Ephraimite, since Elkanah was a Levite, that is, according to Chronicles, he's a Levite, the description Ephraimite can only mean that his family originally belonged to the Kohathite settlements in the territory of Ephraim. If Ramah lay within the borders of Benjamin, it would have to be supposed that Suf, Elkanah's ancestor, moved from the territory assigned to his family in Ephraim. Okay, so that's only if we need to reconcile the genealogy given in 1 Chronicles to the genealogy given here, and how to make sense that there in 1 Chronicles he's a Levi, but here in Samuel he's not. We're not told that he's a Levi. Okay, two wives. Polygamy was permitted in ancient Israelite law, but there's no evidence that it was extensively practiced. In later biblical times, its practice became more and more infrequent. The Midrash suggests that he had married a second wife because Hannah was barren. Okay, and that's related to just reading Achat and Sheni, like first Hannah, then second Penina. Okay, which you could translate it that way. From year to year, on page 2, the Hebrew miyamim yamima, the Targum translates from one festival to another, as if the Hebrew words meant from one set of days to another. But there's no parallel for this usage, and the translation of AJ is confirmed by the cognate phrase shana b'shana in verse 7. It would appear that Elkanah did not observe fully the injunction to appear before the Lord on each of the 3 pilgrim festivals. To worship and to sacrifice, a rabbinical comment reads, prayer is greater than sacrifice, for it states first to worship and then to sacrifice. right? It says lihishtachavot velizboach, to worship or to bow down and to sacrifice. Lord of hosts, this is the first use in the Bible of a title which became current in Israel. Its precise meaning has been the subject of much disputation, some favoring God of the armies of Israel, others God of the hosts of heaven, that is, the stars and angels. Perhaps both senses are contained in the title. Shiloh, where Joshua set up the tabernacle in Joshua 18:1, and where it remained with temporary exceptions until the ark was captured by the Philistines in chapter 4 of this book. From that time, Shiloh ceased to be the national sanctuary, and it's probable that it was occupied or destroyed by the Philistines, so that when the ark was returned, it was allowed to remain in Kiryat Yearim in chapter 7, and the next reference to the sanctuary places it in Nov. But the unrecorded fate of Shiloh became a byword in Israel. The site of Shiloh is accurately defined in Judges 21 and is generally identified with the modern Seilun, about 10 miles north of Beth El. One can still find a platform 400 feet long and 70 feet wide, roughly hewn out of the rocky hillside, which was most likely the site of the sanctuary. The presence of the sanctuary made Shiloh a pivotal center in the history of Israel in the immediate pre-monarchic period. It was in the tragedy of Shiloh that Israel saw her national ruin for the time, and the fall of the city and its priesthood marked the climax of Philistine power over Israel. The two sons, because Eli was very old and probably no longer active in the service of the sanctuary, and because of the vital part which his son's misdeeds played in the development of the narrative, Hophni and Pinchas are mentioned as the active priests. Okay, we'll stop here in the text. Let me just look. We have 3 minutes to look at altar on these 3 verses. So page 241. The story of Hannah provides an instructive illustration of the conventions of narrative exposition that govern a large number of biblical stories. First, the main character or characters are identified by name, pedigree, and geographical location. The only verb used is to be. In this instance, the standard biblical story beginning, "There was a man," is in part a false lead, because the real protagonist of the story is Elkanah's wife, Hannah. Then there is a series of reported actions in the iterative sense. That is, an indication of habitually repeated actions. In all this, compare Job 1. The narrative then zooms in to a particular moment, one of those annually repeated events of Hannah's frustration at Shiloh, by way of Elkanah's dialogue, which could not plausibly be an iterative event. At this point, we have moved from prelude to story proper. The writer himself seems quite conscious of this play between recurring units of time and specific moments in time, the word yamim, days, but often, as in verse 3 with a sense of annual cycle, is used 5 times together with the singular yom in an iterative sense at the beginning of verse 4. These recurrences are complemented by year after year in verse 7. And he had 2 wives. The reference to 2 wives, one childbearing, the other childless, immediately alerts the audience to the unfolding of the familiar Annunciation-type scene. The expected sequence of narrative motifs of the Annunciation scene is the report of the wife's barrenness, amplified by the optional motif of the fertile co-wife, less loved by the husband than is the childless wife, the promise through oracle or divine message or man of God, of the birth of a son, cohabitation resulting in conception and birth. As we shall see, the middle motif is articulated in a way that is distinctive to the concerns of the Samuel story. And then on 242, the 2 sons of Eli, the reference is initially puzzling, but points forward to the focus on proper and improper heirs to the priesthood in Samuel's story. So all these names have a reason why they're given and introduce us to events that are coming up soon. All right, so we'll continue next time, and hope everybody has a good rest of the day, and Shabbat Shalom.
Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you,
Shalom.
Jonah.
Shabbat shalom, and thank you.
Oops.